cosmological argument is one of the traditional arguments that you have to know for your specification. We'll be looking at Aquinas, Hume, Copleston, Russell as needed by the OCR specification, but we will also be looking at the Kalam argument, which is an Arabic version of the cosmological argument. It's not needed by your specification, but I think it's quite a useful addition to have to an essay if you just got an explain the cosmological argument essay, or to use it in a part B because of its idea about infinity. The following points would be very useful in an introduction to an essay. So each of the arguments, as I've said on previous videos, give you clues as to their starting points by the name of it. So the cosmological argument is based on the experience of the universe existing. So cosmos means universe. So the cosmological argument is using the fact that the universe exists rather than not existing to demonstrate that God exists. So therefore it's an a posteriori argument because it's post-experience of the universe. It's inductive, meaning it leads to a probable conclusion. So the strength of the argument relies on having persuasive premises that lead you to support the same conclusion. But this is also a weakness because you could offer different conclusions, which is something that we see Hume does. We can see a clear influence here from Aristotle's argument for the prime mover, especially in Aquinas' work. So the main theologian we're going to be looking at is Aquinas. Aquinas, in his work, the Summa Theologica, has 5 ways, and the first 3 ways are cosmological arguments. So if you got an essay that said, explain the cosmological argument, or explain Aquinas' cosmological argument, you need to have one paragraph where you explain each of the ways, and you need to make sure that you explain all of the premises. If you miss out a premise, it will seem to the examiner that you don't actually understand how the argument works. I'm going to, for each of the 3 ways, show you the full version, and then I'm also going to show you a simpler version. It's up to you to decide which one you want to learn so that you are able to explain it in an essay. If you're going for a strong B or an A, you need to be using the longer version. If you are aiming more for a C or sort of a low B, then maybe you might want to choose the simpler version. So the cosmological argument, the first way, is very much influenced by Aristotle, and it's using this idea of motion, and by motion we mean the movement of something from potentiality to actuality. So you should recognise this language and this concept from Aristotle. Now, if everything is in motion, the next part of what Aquinas is going to try and establish is that things do not move themselves. They must be moved by another. And he gives an example. So, for example, if I have an iron rod or a metal rod, that has the potential to be hot, but it cannot make itself hot. It has to be moved, changed, by something which is actually hot. And in this case, that would be putting the rod into a fire. So he says that nothing can move itself. It must be moved by something which is actually X, actually the thing that the thing has potential for. Now, what this would mean is if nothing is able to move itself, that you're going to have everything being moved by something else. You're going to end up with an infinite chain of regression. And Aquinas argues that an infinite chain of regression is impossible, and he rejects this because otherwise you would never get to an explanation as to why there was motion in the first place. So therefore he argues there must be a first mover who is not put into motion by another, because otherwise the infinite chain would continue, and this is what we understand to be God. And here we have the simpler versions. So it starts with the same empirical premise. An empirical premise is one which is based on observation. So because this is an a posteriori argument, we call this an empirical premise because it's based on the observation of everything in motion. So the first premise, things in the world are in motion. But since nothing moves itself, this chain of motion cannot go on for infinity. Therefore, there must be a first mover who is unmoved, and this is God. So we can see that a lot of this has been slimmed down. Now, the second way, which is the way of the uncaused causer, is really similar to the unmoved mover. And so almost you can sort of revise the unmoved mover and then sort of discuss efficient cause instead. So they're sort of helpful because they're so similar. Now, again, the empirical premise, the observation is that nothing is its own efficient cause. And remember this from Aristotle, efficient cause is the activity, it's the thing which changes something. So if nothing is its own efficient cause, every efficient cause must have an efficient cause. And again, we're going to end up with this infinite regression of causes. Again, Aquinas says that an infinite regression is unsatisfactory because you would never get to an explanation as to where these causes began. And so therefore, it's necessary to admit a first efficient cause, which is itself uncaused, because you would have the infinite regression continuing if it did. And this is what we understand to be God. And here we have the simpler version. This is probably a really similar idea to what you would have read at GCSE. Finally, we have the different style of Aquinas' cosmological argument, which is the argument from contingency. This is slightly more difficult to explain, but I think it's well worth pursuing, because if you can explain this really well, it will really impress the examiners, as they will more than likely read more of the simpler versions. And so this one is based on the idea of contingency. Aquinas would not have used the term contingent or necessity or necessary being, but these are terms that we've later applied to Aquinas' work. So he says, in nature we observe things which are possible to be and not to be. So for example, it's possible for me to exist. I'm existing now, so I know that, but also there will be a time when I won't exist, and I know I haven't done in the future. So I'm an example of what we would call a contingent being. Now, he says it's impossible for them always to exist, because that's what it means to be a contingent being. But then it's possible, therefore, that at one point nothing existed if everything was contingent, because it's possible for them to not exist. But if this was true and nothing existed at one point, then there would be nothing in existence now, because they can't bring themselves into existence. So we therefore must have to have a different type of being, and this being is what he would call necessary. And this is something where it's not possible for it to not exist. It has to exist. Now, he says there's an option. Either this necessary thing has its necessity caused by another necessary being, or it doesn't. It's its own cause of its own necessity. Now, Aquinas is going to opt for this one, the not. And that's because if it had its necessity caused by another necessary being, well, then you're going to end up with an infinite chain of regression of necessary beings. So therefore, we have to have a being which is its own cause of its own necessity. It is just a necessary being. It's not caused to be by anything. It's a necessary being. And this is what we call God. So this is the simpler version. Now, there's nothing wrong in using this. If you are finding it really difficult to understand the other one, then use this. It's better to use the simpler one rather than get something really wrong and lose marks. What I will say is that don't just give up with the other version if it's difficult. Have a go, try and explain it in your own words, get your teacher to check it, and if it's still not working out, then do use the simpler version. Again and again, candidates are still saying that Aquinas is arguing for a first cause, and then they use the example of the domino rally. But actually, the domino rally is wrong. It probably was something that your GCSE teacher may have used to help you understand the first cause argument. And you can get away with it at GCSE, but not at A level. And the reason why it's wrong is because if we have the idea of a domino rally, we have this idea of a first cause, something that just pushes the first domino over. Now, what could happen is that this cause could just vanish. It doesn't have to be about anymore. But what Aquinas is arguing for is something which is more like a sustaining cause or a sustaining mover, something that keeps things in motion and keeps things in the cause and effect, so that we have, in the same way as the prime mover for Aristotle, it's the thing which keeps everything in a continuous motion. I think that this is something really good to end an essay with, to really demonstrate to the examiner that you understand what type of cause, what type of mover Aquinas is arguing for. It's come up once before, and it can be something that comes up again, where it says, explain the criticisms of the cosmological argument from David Hume. So if this essay did come up, what I would like you to do is, first of all, have one paragraph where you summarise the cosmological argument. And because David Hume is most concerned with the idea of cause and effect, I would mainly talk about the first way and the second way, and you could summarise those. Then discuss each of the challenges and explain why they are challenges to Aquinas' first and second way. So the key one that kind of trickles down on all of them is the idea that Hume argues that we oversimplify this notion of cause and effect. We have a habit of mind where we like to think that there are neat links between cause and effect. An example used in the textbooks are things like if you put your hand out to hail a bus, you may assume that you caused that bus to stop, and that's a very nice way, neat way to think. I've caused that, that's the effect. However, causes and effects aren't that simple. I've hailed the bus, I've put my hand out, but we don't know if someone on the bus actually rang the bell to stop it. We don't know if the driver has to stop because he's subject to a timetable, etc. We cannot just see that things fall neatly into cause and effect patterns. He also argues is, why do we have to appeal to a necessary being? Why not the universe be the necessary cause for its own existence? Why does it have to be God? He also says, why does the cause of the universe have to be God? Could it not be an infant God who perhaps made a mistake and vanished? It could be a league of angels. So what he's doing there is really picking apart the fact that this is an inductive argument. Remember, it only leads to a probable conclusion or a possible conclusion. Maybe we can think of alternative conclusions. The other famous one, which is used by Bertrand Russell later, is the fallacy of composition. And what this is a logical fallacy where you believe that the nature of the parts means that the nature of the whole, the composition, is the same. So Bertrand Russell famously says, just because every human has a mother doesn't mean the human race as a whole has a mother. Make sure you don't use that quote and say it's Hume. You could explain Hume. He just says you shouldn't ascribe the same nature of the parts to the whole. You could say this is later explained by Russell using that quote, but don't say that the mother race one is Hume. And also, Hume just questions, why must the universe have a beginning? Maybe the universe is infinite, maybe it has always existed. And I would say this is probably another habit of our mind that we see things every day as having a beginning, and so we just assume that the universe must have a beginning. Before we move on to Copleston, it's important to understand who he was influenced by, and he was influenced by Leibniz. Now, Leibniz developed something called the principle of sufficient reason. Because of Hume's criticisms and other challenges, cosmological arguments start to not be about cause and effect. Lots of people do think that this is too simplified. What they start to talk about is explanation or sufficient reason. Now, Leibniz says that everything has a sufficient reason, but it doesn't contain within itself its own sufficient reason. And the sufficient reason is an explanation as to why something is the way it is and it isn't like something else. So, for example, why am I here? Why am I my particular age or my gender, or how did I get here, rather than not being here at all? So a a total explanation as to why something is the way it is, and we cannot be our own sufficient reasons. And Copleston is going to use Aquinas' contingency argument with Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason. And Copleston presents his argument in this famous radio debate between Bertrand Russell and Frederick Copleston. Copleston is a Jesuit priest, so he's coming from a Catholic priest order, and Russell is a British philosopher, very famous British philosopher, but also an atheist. So Copleston's argument, we can see, is really influenced by this idea of sufficient reason and Aquinas' third way, which was based on contingency. So he says, we know that there are at least some beings in the world which do not contain in themselves the reason for their existence. So, for example, us, a cat, a table, anything. When we look around us, they can't explain the reason why they exist and the way they are. Now, he says, the world is simply the real or imagined totality of aggregate of individual objects. What he's saying is the world is the total of all of these things which do not contain within themselves the reason for their own existence. And so he says this totality of things which don't contain within themselves the reason for their own existence must have a reason as a total, as a whole. And he says either this thing is itself the reason for its own existence, and we would call this a necessary being, which Copleston is going to argue for, or this reason as to why the total of all of the things within the world exists could have something which is the reason for its own existence. So this is really similar to Aquinas, where he said either it causes its own necessity, or it has its necessity caused by another. He says, however, if it's not its own reason for its own existence, this cause, then we would end up with an infinity of reasons for of sufficient reasons. So therefore, we wouldn't really come to a conclusion. We wouldn't come to an explanation as to why things exist. So therefore, we must argue that this thing contains within itself the reason for its own existence, which cannot not exist, which is a necessary being. And here I've just included the quotation. So this might be something that you might want to pause and just note down any of the sort of nice little phrases. I think something that's quite useful is this part where Copleston is using an example of himself as a contingent being, that he depends on his parents, etc., for why he exists. And then the parts that I've put in yellow I think are quite useful to know, because they'll become relevant for Russell's criticism about the fallacy of composition. And what we can see here is because Copleston uses the reference to human race, is why Russell uses the human race as an example for the fallacy of composition. Russell's major first criticism is that he rejects that the term necessary can be applied to God, to a being. He argues that only statements and propositions can be necessary. So, for example, all bachelors are unmarried men is an analytic statement, because the definition of bachelor is an unmarried man, so that statement cannot not be anything other than that statement. So it's a necessary statement. And Russell says this is fine, you can have statements which are necessary, but you can't apply it to God. It doesn't make sense to say that a being is necessary. It has to be decided as to whether something exists or not. It's something which is a synthetic statement which you need to prove through evidence, not through just using a definition or an idea. This is his most famous criticism, and the fallacy of composition. So exactly the same as Hume, but famously Russell uses, just because humans have a mother doesn't mean that the entire human race has a mother. So the nature of the whole isn't necessarily the same as the parts, and this is a logical fallacy. And we can see why he talks about human race, because that's what Copleston uses himself. The third criticism that Russell raises is he questions Copleston's use of the idea of sufficient reason. So first of all he starts, Copleston, what do you mean by sufficient reason? You don't mean cause, do you? And Copleston says, no, I don't. I don't mean cause, I mean a sufficient reason. And then Russell says, so what is a sufficient reason? And Copleston says, well, it's when you have a total adequate explanation as to why something is the way it is. And Russell says, well, what's the sufficient reason of, say, a match being lit? And would it be that I just have strike the match using the box? What would be the sufficient reason, the total explanation that would be adequate as to why that match was lit? And Copleston says, well, it's more than that. It's just not that it's just been striked across the matchbox. And so Russell says, well, I think you're looking for something that can't be got. You will never be able to get a complete and total adequate explanation as to why something is the way it is. So therefore, you cannot use it as the starting point of an argument because it's not a reliable starting point. It's something that you can't ever get. You can't get a sufficient reason. And then Russell's final point is that he just says the universe is a brute fact. It just exists and that is it. And this is where sort of Copleston responds and says, well, if you won't sit down at the table, we can't be checkmated. And it's that idea that really, because they won't agree on the use of terms like necessity and sufficient reason, they can't really engage further in the debate. They are at odds with one another. They can't ever really engage with it because they're on such different sides. So some general criticism of the cosmological argument. Remember, it's an inductive argument, so it comes to a probable conclusion. You could argue that the cause of the universe does not have to be God, but it could be the Big Bang, and you could use evidence to justify that, so maybe the redshift effect. So you could try and argue in a part B that this is more persuasive. You might actually want to argue that the universe actually could be infinite. We might struggle with that idea and we like to think there's a beginning, but maybe that's just because we're limited by our minds, but that doesn't mean that it's not possible. Brian Davis also says that cosmological arguments don't just work on their own. You have to supplement them with, say, something like the design argument to make them more secure. And I think this quotation is quite interesting from an introduction to philosophy of religion. He says, it seems a reasonable one as an argument, as establishing a first cause, but by itself it does not establish the existence of God with all of the properties sometimes ascribed to him. And that links to Hume's point, even if we did say it was God, who's to say it's the Christian God? It could be an infant God, it could be a league of gods. So it might just show there's the first cause, but does it really pinpoint to a Christian God or to a Muslim God? Maybe not. Now, the additional part that you could use, especially in a part B, because I think it's quite useful to discuss the idea of infinity, but also if you did get and explain the cosmological argument, you could use this as an additional version. So the Kalam argument is a medieval Islamic argument, famously put forward by Al-Kindi and Al-Ghazali. And it's a very simple argument, but what's absolutely key is some of the assumptions behind premise 2. So premise 1, everything which has a beginning has a cause. Premise 2, the universe has a beginning, therefore the universe has a cause, and this is God. Now, within the second premise is the assumption that the universe must have a beginning. And what they're doing is they're rejecting that the universe could be infinite. So they're trying to say that infinity in reality is not possible. Infinity is a mathematical concept and it's something we can think about, but actually it doesn't exist in reality. And if it doesn't exist in reality, it's not possible for the universe to have a beginning, and therefore the universe must have a cause. Now, several of the criticisms could be that actual infinites could exist. Maybe our mind just can't comprehend them, and so we shouldn't limit the universe because of the limits of our own mind. It was later developed by someone called William Lane Craig, and he admired the logic. So he was a Christian philosopher, might still be alive, And he said that he agreed with this idea that while we might have theoretical infinites, actual infinites don't exist. And he gave the example of the bookcase. And he said, imagine if you had an infinite bookcase. You can never take away a book, or you can never add to the bookcase, because each part of infinity has to be infinite. And so it doesn't make sense as a concept when you try to put it into something like reality. So the universe can't be infinite because we can't add to the universe. The universe, like if we think about time can't move on because each part of the universe has to be infinite. So he agreed that the universe must have a beginning because it can't be infinite. And what he also adds is that this cause must be God. So to the conclusion, because only God, who is omnipotent and omniscient and transcendent, etc., all the other attributes, could cause something like the universe.